Welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga. I'm Alex Hochuli. We've got George Hoare in London, Phil Cunliffe in Canterbury, and we're very happy to be joined today by Jennifer Silva, who listeners may know. She's the author of the most recently of We're Still Here, Pain and Politics at the Heart of America. She's assistant professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington. And we're going to talk about working class pain and working class politics more generally in America ahead of next year's presidential election. We've actually tried to avoid talking about the sort of entering into the circus of the US perma-election, but we are going to broach it a little bit here today. So hi, Jennifer, first of all. How's it going with you?
It's great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted to finally talk to you. And I think I want to kick off by jumping into the politics before we move into the kind of substance of your book. But I wanted to highlight one thing, which is that one of your respondents that you spoke to in your research memorably summed up the 2016 presidential election by saying, rather President Dickhead than President Sellout, which I really loved. Do you think this was borne out?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it was borne out, though it's difficult to know, which candidate would fall under which label. But I think it sort of speaks to the idea that, they felt like they were choosing between someone who was, corrupt and had, sold their soul to corporations versus someone who was kind of a nasty person, but who could be trusted.
Wait,
so I think that's
which?
how they. Well, that's the interesting part. Where now it seems like I'm not sure what I think there's lots of arguments that could be made that Trump was just as much of a sellout, but I don't know if they would feel that way though.
I think prior to 2016, it did seem that Hillary was on course to be the sellout.
That's right.
Yeah, but I mean that's I guess how things unravel. But yeah, I think it's such a great. I just want to read the quote out that you start the book with, because I think it's just such a great way to frame some of the problems that and some of the issues and themes that come a little bit later. So one of your respondents says, "I love women and I think they can do anything that a man can do, but that woman should not be the president of the United States. So help me God. But neither should that jackass." So it's like, who the frick do you pick? I'm like, you're not giving us much of a choice here. Either way, we're going to be destroyed. Now, if there was somebody else worthy, I'd probably go in that direction because it's a joke. At the end of the day, I'd rather have President Dickhead than President Sellout. I mean, do you think this is a good way to sort of frame some of these, I guess, issues around the puzzle of working class politics and where the skepticism towards politics in general comes from?
I think so. And what I really liked about this is actually one of the first interviews I did for the book. And working class people are often characterized as sort of apathetic or disengaged or not really understanding their interests. And to me, like, this interview, it's like, no, she, Bree knows like pretty much exactly what's going on and she can sum up what's happening. And she has a really good sense that no one is really for her interests. Like she's obviously very smart and, not shy. So I liked that as a way to start it, to say, she's kind of given up on politics and she probably has good reason to distrust politicians. But it's not because she's not educated or informed. She's actually quite informed. And
is able to capture the terrible choice presented very in a very, very concise and quite compelling way.
She does, yes.
So I guess maybe just to move into some of the questions to broaden out the discussion a little bit around how the book emerged. What was the starting point? What was the initial research project that you started on? Because it was initially you were looking at working class conservatism, but it developed a little bit from that starting point, didn't it?
It's true. I often start books with one idea and then it kind of takes me into this totally different direction. And then by the end of the data collection, I'm like, oh no, what's happened? So I would say I was very interested in this question of white working class conservatives and, why it is that people seem to vote against their own economic interests. And, I'm not really a political sociologist, so I wanted to kind of approach this question by listening to people's stories and trying to understand their systems of meaning. And luckily, I didn't write that book because many people wrote that book in 2016. And so I was in the field and I was trying to, talk to people about their political ideas. And I really had a very hard time finding anyone who would fall into this sort of white working class conservative who voted against their economic interests and, was very religious or, loved their guns more than they cared about their wages. I just didn't really find that. And so, I would find people who were actually very critical of politicians and very critical of big businesses, people who actually did believe there should be a larger safety net and that rich people should pay more taxes. And then who were, pretty disengaged and didn't really, it's like they weren't turning to religion. They really just didn't believe in anything anymore. And so it shifted my research focus away from what I thought it would be, which I think in some ways is more interesting. And it shows so much more diversity of, opinion and thought within the working class.
I think it definitely comes through in some of the later parts of the book, describing how this disengagement, the reasons, the forms, and some of the, avenues in which potentially political impulses get diverted down from ranging from conspiracy theories to mindfulness and all of this sort of thing, but not to get ahead of ourselves, because I think there is
could I just jump in before just before we get stuck in? Yeah. Thank you, George. I got a question, Jennifer, about working class in America because so usually, the case is presented as that everyone, the cliche is that everyone is presented in America as if they're middle class, or the middle class refers to people who are both blue collar and white collar. So could you clarify what working class meant in the context, what you think it means and what it meant in the context of your book? What kind of people did you talk to in the sense of where did they live? What kind of jobs might they have had? What was the demographic or sociological profile of your respondents, and how would they understand working class? Because it would help to clarify for our listeners who they're all over the world, and obviously working class means different things in different contexts.
It's interesting because I am aware of the sort of saying that everyone in America thinks that they're middle class, and that's often sort of used to say that they don't understand where they fall in the income distribution. But the people I talked to actually were very willing to call themselves either workers or laborers or even poor. And I thought that was sort of interesting development. So the people I was speaking to, so I was in the anthracite coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania. So this is an area that basically peaked economically, about 100 years ago. And, like 1 million families were supported by anthracite mining. And it was an area that was well known for having a very militant working class of miners. So it's like having lots of strikes and sometimes even violence, a lot of class conflict between miners and coal mine owners. And also famous for sort of having this very strong working class community, so that if miners were striking, people would kind of rely on each other and help each other get by. And so I was kind of, my vision of class was coming out of the history of mining and, workers, mostly like white male workers. And then for me, the interesting part is like, well, what happens to class when there's no more coal jobs and when the men aren't really working, or their men aren't able to support families anymore on their wages. And we also see families not as strong or stable as they used to be, and also communities becoming much kind of weaker. And so it's like, for me, it's like almost trying to understand like what happens to the working class when, this very clear vision of working class as miners goes away. And I think they were kind of trying to figure that out too.
Yeah, I think that context and that history comes through in a few of the interviews that you relate particularly. I guess maybe before though we move on to sort of essentially what you found, maybe just a quick question on how you collected the data for the book, what you actually did, because I think in the UK, amongst other places, there's a bit of an issue sometimes with journalists bravely leaving London to go into the provinces to find people with regional accents who then come to represent the whole of the working class on a news broadcast in a vox pop, and your approach is a little bit different to this, isn't it? This kind of quite tokenistic representation of the working class in some media forms that is particularly obvious in the UK.
I think that's right. And I would say here we have a similar problem where it's usually kind of the older white male factory worker who's sort of down on his luck and becoming very racist and angry. So I did try to move beyond that. The way I did it was, these are kind of places where everyone knows everyone. And so I just started showing up to a lot of public events, like high school football games are huge. They have these big parties and tailgates and everyone comes out for the games. And there was also a lot of drug addiction kind of community forums going on at the same time because there was a heroin epidemic happening, and then lots of kind of town meetings and other kinds of events. So I just started showing up and
so it was okay for you to show up? I mean, particularly at something like drug addiction community events, it was okay for you to show up in those contexts as a stranger?
A high school auditorium, and there'd be a panel of, the county coroner and the police chief would be there. And so I would just sort of like show up and look around. And then eventually I met someone who brought me basically to a different drug addiction support group that she was part of. And they allowed me to come in, and I didn't collect any data at this point. I was just meeting people. And then we sort of became friends. And so she started taking me around and introducing me to people. And then they started being a little bit more open with me. And I was able to start talking to people about the research and asking if they'd meet with me one-on-one. And this probably took almost a year, I would say, from the time I started. And then as I kept going, what was interesting is that a lot of the white people I was speaking to kept telling me about the newcomers who were usually Black or Puerto Rican and coming from cities and moving to the area. And so then I kind of crossed this racial divide within the coal region by talking to women like Bree who maybe actually were willing to date Black men. And then trying to understand the sort of new and more diverse working class who is also in the coal region. So I would say after spending that much time, there definitely isn't just one image of working class. There's, lots of different people with different backgrounds.
So I guess maybe to move on to some of the things that you found through these conversations. I mean, one of the major themes of the book clearly is this idea of pain. It appears in the subtitle. How was pain experienced by the people, and experienced and understood by the people that you spoke with? Why do you think it becomes so central?
Yeah, that's so interesting because I didn't really go into the research with actually any questions about pain. I always sort of go in with the wrong questions. I did this with my other book too, but I went in with a lot of questions about politics and politicians and voting history and kinds of policies people believed in. And so I was sort of like, I kept sticking to my questions, and then most people were they were willing to answer my questions, but then they would try to take the conversation to other places, which was usually about their own kind of personal suffering and what they'd been through and sort of how they understood who they were and why they'd ended up in the position they were in. And a lot of it would be talking about pain within their families, either growing up or currently, talking about struggles with mental health or addiction or violence. And they would still be able to connect their feelings to politics, but they definitely weren't starting with kind of abstract ideas about what policies were right. They wanted to start by talking about their own lives. And I was sort of like thinking about, how do we connect an individual up to this idea of class, or how do we connect an individual up to a bigger sense of a unit? And it's like, well, maybe pain in a way is like how the individuals could connect up to this larger sense of connection, because that was one of the only things that people seem to share.
I think it's really interesting that you sort of almost alluded in your answer there to this idea of how you develop class consciousness. And do you think that pain is a kind of a viable route to this? Because I think it's quite striking that it seems like some of the people that you speak to manage their pain in quite an individual way, and almost are skeptical of other people's pain, sort of almost labeling them as not strong enough if they can't bear it. Do you think that it is an individualized experience, or do you think it does have that route potentially towards solidarity of some sort?
For me, I do think there's potential for it. People were able to kind of point to causes of their suffering that went beyond individuals. They were able to talk about poverty or racism, or actions taken by politicians that had created pain, and they were actually able to draw these connections by saying first the jobs went away, and then we see alcoholism going up, and we see men losing their sense of self and becoming more violent. So I think that they could draw those connections, and that there were some spaces where people would sort of help each other or try to make these connections. But there were also instances, as you said, where this was diverted and it almost became a contest to show who could survive more pain. And that became like one of the only ways they could show that they were people who were, dignified, which is to say, look what I've been through.
I think it comes through in some of the themes that you draw out of some of the interviews, that for quite a few of the people that you spoke with, pain seems to be linked to some ideas of redemption almost, and it's a way in which I guess sort of pain can be a sign that an experience is potentially formative. It can give a sort of a meaning to an unpleasant experience, because it leads to something sort of better in the near future. Do you think? Did this come through as a potential interpretation of the way that people were feeling the politicized pain?
I think so. So I think that they magnify the sort of positive consequences of suffering, and they say, look, like this suffering made me into who I was today. But I think that could then kind of go different ways. One way it could go was to say, we sort of have this shared suffering, and we could, use all of this energy we have and this struggle we have to make changes, or it could go another way, which is to say, retreat from other people and just celebrate myself for having survived. One of the spaces where I think there is potential is when people thought about their own children, and they realized that they actually wanted to make changes for their children so that they didn't go through what they had been through. And that, and there I would see kind of small acts of women challenging social order in order to help their kids, even if it was something small, like, going to the school and fighting with a teacher who wasn't treating their kid well. And so in moments like that, there might be some potential for people not just wanting their kids to suffer, but actually wanting to change the situation.
I guess one interpretation of the discussion so far is that potentially this is all a little bit depressing, or kind of a bit of a downer. But I guess maybe a question before moving on to gender that you just alluded to. What about pain relief? Is this just in terms of drugs, or are there mindfulness and spirituality and conspiracy theories, which I mentioned earlier? Are these sort of escapes of some sort as well, opiates of a type?
I think so. So people are suffering, and some of the things that they turn to deal with their suffering are food and cigarettes and drugs, and those do serve to numb their pain. And there are other ways that they would numb their pain, such as, self-help. So, joining a positive thinking group and trying to, change their attitude, or also kind of retreating into conspiracy theory. So this is another thing I didn't really expect to be as powerful in the research. Kind of the story, basically people saying like the whole system is rigged. You can never trust anyone in power. They're bullies. They're trying to control us. It was actually much more critical.
Could you give us I was just going to say, could you give us maybe some examples of the specific content of the kinds of conspiracy theories?
Yeah, and it's interesting because people would usually start off making sort of leftist critical arguments like, for example, how absurd is it that an individual can own a private prison and, profit off of people's pain? Or how crazy is it that, these pharmaceutical companies make so much money basically getting people addicted to drugs and then make so much money on the medicine that's supposed to get them off of the drugs. And so it would they'd have this like very critical edge. And then they'd sort of keep going and then be like, well, that's crazy. And if that could happen, then maybe, the fluoride in the water is also mind control. Or like when you see a plane driving by and there's, smoke coming out of the plane, maybe that's drugs. Or maybe the government's going to turn into martial law and eliminate all the poor people because there's not enough resources. And so it would sort of, or maybe would start off and saying, there's no clean water for poor people. And then, say, oh, the government wants them all to die anyway. And so it's like, it almost felt to me like they would, in some ways have instincts that were very critical and correct. And then they would kind of go down, in a way, it felt like rabbit holes, and then decide that, the government was totally against them and wanted to control their minds and eliminate them.
How do you read this, or how do you think this can be explained? Because it does seem in some of the interviews that you discussed in the book that there is that quite as you said, leftist starting point, and then at some point the argument takes a bit of a turn that maybe not quite expecting into what is essentially a conspiracy theory.
And I would say, like, sometimes I'd be doing the interview and I'd be like, oh, maybe they're right. It's sort of
well,
like, huh. And so, yeah. And they, this is like such a good example where they'd be like, for example, they'd say, soldiers are totally brainwashed. Like, why should I want to fight against someone in another country who's also forced to be a soldier? And, I don't really believe that America stands for anything. And so they'd be like extremely critical and, almost have this vision of solidarity. And then they might like take it a little further and say, the Illuminati are controlling everything. And I'd sort of lose them. But I don't know. I do think, but part of it I think is that they see all these truths about the world and about kind of corruption and about distrust. And then because they're so on their own, a lot of them times they would go towards their phone and use the internet and try to start looking things up. And so maybe an argument about, 9/11 and the attacks might have become sort of starts as a critique of the United States and their role as a global power, but then it suddenly becomes like, oh, but the attacks never happened, or school shootings never happened at all, and they're all created, and so it kind of takes them in this other direction.
Yeah, no, I mean, I imagine we've all had debates like that, with some random person at a bar or whatever, where you end up starting off on kind of a quite critical line. You're like, yeah, okay, well, this is quite interesting. Yeah, this guy, we're really seeing eye to eye, and then, as you say, it kind of veers off in a random direction. And I guess it strikes me as being, a kind of a certain lack of coherence in terms of an understanding of where I guess a critical posture slides into complete mistrust of any sort of mainstream narrative about, be it 9/11 or school shootings or any of the examples that you've given. But it strikes me as like a kind of a lack of any political organization which would give coherence to those arguments, right? I mean, I guess that's how I would try to explain it.
Yeah, but it's also, it's trying to explain tremendously abstract impersonal forces of economic change and social transformation that are very difficult to understand unless you kind of put them in terms of agency. very directly in terms of agency or a sinister kind of plot to achieve a particular end.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't ignore the fact that I think liberal conspiracy theories since 2016 have really flourished. I mean, think about approaches to Russia's influence in the election or Pizzagate. There's
I suppose it's interesting. They're of a different kind, though, in a way, aren't they? Because that's to, so it's not it's not trying to explain the decline of industry in a particular part of the country, which is a result of automation and offshoring and so on. The kind of liberal conspiracy theories are qualitatively different.
Mm.
Anyway, we're getting off track.
Sorry, Jennifer.
The people I spoke to, as you said, they're not really connected to any organization, and so their theories it's very eclectic. They're kind of like picking and choosing pieces from so many different ones, and they're very like proud of how they can kind of try to put it together into this, whole explanatory framework. And they're very isolated when they do that. So they might be talking to other people on the internet, but they're not really talking to the people around them.
No, I think that comes through the I guess the individual nature of some of the explanations, which I think we all have to a greater or lesser extent, but that's hardly surprising if there's a couple of steps removed from organized political forces that catalyze and organize thinking in those sorts of ways, I guess. But the point that we were maybe going to move on to before we got down this rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, if you will, was around gender, because this comes through, I think, in a really interesting way in the book, and particularly maybe notions of masculinity and legacy. I mean, what do you think the role of gender is in the discussions that you had?
It's sort of, that's interesting, because I think men and women were experiencing class in a really different way, and then the process that they were dealing with changing class was not really symmetrical. So for men who in a way were kind of at the center of this industrial working class, for them there was this immense sense of loss. So a sense of loss about being a protector and being someone who would support their family and a provider, and kind of sense of pride. And many of the men would talk about the generations before them. So they talk about their fathers and grandfathers who worked in very dangerous conditions, but they were willing to sacrifice their bodies for their families. And they would talk about the kinds of connections that, their families were part of. And in a way, like, they didn't know what to do anymore. So because they didn't, they might still have a sense that there should be some kind of economic justice, but they didn't really have much of a connection to other workers anymore. For some of them, they didn't even know what it meant to be working class anymore, and they were kind of giving up on connections to others altogether. And I think they just didn't really know where their identity should come from. And for some of them, that also meant that having power over ethnic minorities and women became much more important, because they had lost so much of that provider role. And so for men, in some ways, like, the women are very interesting, because for them, it's like, in a way, it hasn't only been a story of loss, because it's also a story of having more freedoms in terms of gender. But in a lot of ways, like, the women are trying to cope with the men. So trying to figure out, like, if my job is not to be married and raise children, and, I don't have this sort of white picket fence that I imagined I would, then who am I, and how do I want to remake myself?
Yeah, and I think that I guess that absence of the center of identity come through quite clearly. And just, I think you did mention this in what you were saying, but what do you think comes to sort of fill this gap, perhaps particularly for some of the men that you spoke to?
So I think for some men, especially the ones who still believe that there should be some kind of economic justice, so people who believe there should be higher minimum wage and who really believed in unions and thought that there should be higher taxes, for these men, what often happened was that they'd make clear distinctions between who was deserving and who wasn't. And these were often kind of based on race or ethnicity or nationality. So it'd be sort of like, well, my grandfather fought really hard for workers' rights and, for pensions or for wages. And it's not really fair that these other people, didn't fight for it and, they get special treatment. And so the kind of authority over women and racial minorities, in a way, almost went hand in hand with preserving any kind of sense of solidarity with other white workers. And that was kind of one way. But we could also see other men, especially younger men, who didn't really have a sense of belonging to a class. They only saw themselves as individuals. And so, they wanted to be recognized for, making sacrifices and taking risks. So people would be very proud to say, like, I break my body for 12 hours a day and nobody owes me anything. I'm proud of that. It's my choice. And these men wouldn't maybe be as racist because they'd say everyone's an individual, but then they wouldn't have any sense that, a business owed them anything.
No, I think, that's such a great sort of summary of some of the really interesting, complex themes that come through in the book. But I think Alex had a question that follows on from that before keep talking.
Because I think a lot of you were talking there about relative loss versus, I guess, absolute loss, or the way that, for example, women in some ways have gained over this period and have to a large extent become more equal to men than they were in the 1970s, for example, when the working class as a whole was on a more solid footing, kind of socially as a whole. There were more steady jobs and so on. I think a lot of the kind of liberal and certainly like identitarian discourse focuses purely on these relative gains, right? They focus on men versus women or one race versus another, and don't look at the question of class. I think obviously your work seems to mediate both of those things very, very well. And I guess my question is, are you able, or would you be willing to sort of generalize in any way about the way that in the self-consciousness of the people that you spoke to, whether they focus more on kind of relative gains and losses in terms of a gender identity or racial identity or what have you, or they really see themselves as a class losing, or just really perhaps just as an individual, and there's no identification whether on gender or race grounds at all?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think that for example, for white men, there was definitely a sense of class decline for sure. And when white women were really interesting too, because they'd observe the kind of decline of white men, and they'd actually like be very aware, and they'd say, look at these men, they've lost the kind of class privilege that they had. They've kind of lost the role of the ability to use their masculinity as a way to be superior. And like, look at them now, they're becoming racist and they're walking around the town with guns, and they're doing that to compensate. And so there was like also a lot of awareness where the white women, it's like their fortunes were no longer as tied to the white men because they didn't have to rely on them, and they were kind of able to see clearly what was going on with the way white men were almost compensating. And so I thought that was interesting. And then, the white women, I would say they still primarily saw themselves in sort of a family role, and they were kind of trying to figure out who they were if they didn't play that role. And so in a way, like the sort of industrial working class family breaks up and they're trying to figure out what their role is. And so, but then if we looked at the kind of newcomers in town who were Black and mostly Puerto Rican, there was actually like a lot more hope towards the future. So they weren't telling a story of decline. They were telling a story of possibly actually being able to be more successful in the future, even though their lives were actually much worse.
So just to pick up on this this point, we haven't really explicitly talked about race yet, but it runs through the whole book, and you've mentioned this idea of newcomers a couple of times. I mean, could you maybe just explain to us a little bit what you think that the role of race maybe in structuring the argument of the book was, or more generally in the in the interviews that you that you had?
Yeah, part of what was interesting to me is that there's many books about the white working class, and especially about white working class men. And we kind of watch how white working class people use race as a kind of almost like a foil. So they make themselves feel better by saying, well, I work harder than, black people, or, I'm still superior. Like, I may not have any money and I may have lost my job, but, I'm white and I have that to kind of, support myself. And so,
sorry, just to jump in, would they say that directly? I'm better because I'm white. Or would it come across kind of indirectly, or how would it come across when they say something like that?
So for the people I spoke to, most of them would not say I'm better because I'm say that. Although I will say there were a few people I spoke to who were kind of known around town for their very explicit white nationalist views. And so I actually did end up talking to a few people who were part of kind of small organizations that actually you had to be white to join, and they did see something very special about white culture. And that was also a shock to me because they weren't race blind. They were very race aware and were willing to talk about it.
Yeah, just to maybe expand on this a little bit, you talk to somebody who considers themselves a white gentleman, but their perhaps his attitudes don't really seem entirely gentlemanly. Could you maybe sort of, explain this a little bit, how this quite this kind of moral, upstanding view of oneself could possibly coexist with what seems to be quite white nationalist, potentially, views?
Yeah, so I had heard about, this is Brian, and when I was interviewing other people, and I was sort of told by a few of them that I should try to talk to him, because I think he was also seen as a little bit as kind of crazy person in the coal region, but because for how extreme he was. And so I did end up talking to Brian, and he was, a working class guy who was, struggling to support his family, struggling to keep his family together, and had really embraced white nationalism. And for him, he was making this point that, he wasn't really, I think he was trying to say that he wasn't really violent and he wasn't openly racist and he didn't use racial slurs, but that he was in a way really into protecting and preserving and celebrating white culture. So he was trying to say that, I think he was in a way trying to say he wasn't racist, but then, he was kind of trying to present himself to me as very reasonable, and and his dad had been in like a biker nationalist gang, which was kind of, I think, more openly violent. But anyway, so he was interesting because he was telling me how important it was to maintain white pride, and then he also had organized a march around town that was about taking our town back. And he didn't talk about it in racial language. He said it was about getting drug dealers out and drug users out and making the park safe for the children again. But when I talked to other people in town, it was clear that it was only white men marching, and they had their guns, and they would purposely walk by areas that were inhabited by people of color, and the people of color felt very threatened by this and didn't feel like they could join the march. And so that was, in a way, that there was this tension in the town between the newcomers who were not white and then the white people, and the white people would blame the newcomers for destroying the town. And then the newcomers would be like, no, the town was already destroyed. That's why we're here, because it's cheap, that we can afford to live. And so I think it was interesting to me that there was such conflict over the idea of place. So they were kind of fighting over, what had happened and where they were, and, who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. And it just brought a lot of tension into the book.
So I guess maybe to sort of move on from some of the things which you found on the more of the individual interviews to some of the themes which, or maybe some of the implications of the analysis. I mean, one of the really big questions is around working class political disengagement, which obviously is the starting point of the book, and runs all the way through it. I mean, do you think you could maybe summarize it a little bit? What do you think are the major reasons and forms for this disengagement? I think we've touched on quite a few of them already, but just to pull it all together a little bit, because I think this is one of the things which really leaves you after you've finished reading the book is potentially how deep some of these, anybody who's interested in socialist organizing, it's quite sobering how deep perhaps some, and how understandable some of this disengagement is.
It is. So I would say that part of the takeaway is that, when I tried to talk about politics with the working class, they wanted to kind of talk about a very broad array of things that were affecting them and causing them pain. And that went from, family troubles and addiction and unemployment and poverty and racism, incarceration and corruption and violence and illness. And so I think it's really interesting that these were topics that were political for them, and that they were actually very critical of how they had ended up in having these troubles. So they were very critical of economic inequality. They were very critical of politicians who had failed to do their job and care about them and protect them from poverty and exploitation. But I would say from there, they would have this realization, and from there, it would kind of be derailed. So instead of turning into any kind of collective action, it would usually result in withdrawal. And a big reason why that happened was that they would be trying to figure out how to make their suffering make sense. And they would do it by saying, okay, well, my suffering made me who I am. I shouldn't, trust other people. I should only take care of myself. It's smarter if I remove myself from American society, detach and not trust anyone than it would be to actually work with anyone else.
Just wanted to take the opportunity to ask and try to maybe connect this to some of your other work as well, in terms of we've written about the model of therapeutic selfhood, where people are very much focused on markers of personal growth and things like this. And I wanted to ask how would you connect these two things? I guess is that experience of pain and dealing with that basically completely unmediated and trapped within that, and therefore not mediated to any broader social experience, the experience of other people's pain that might be similar to theirs. If I could, referring to the question George asked earlier about the possibility for solidarity on that basis. Do you see this as part of a whole?
Yeah, I think that kind of drawing strength from suffering and defining themselves as people who could, go through a lot of pain and were responsible for changing themselves. That definitely came through in both books. And I think that, for the working class, this is kind of a necessary thing because they don't see any other way of making sense of the immense suffering that they're going through. But also, I do think that in this book, it seemed to me like there was also a lot more critique and a lot more awareness of kind of social and cultural and economic forces that were exploitative and that were unfair and that should be changed. And I thought people were kind of willing to say, it's really unfair that, there are billionaires, whereas our kids can't even have, art lessons in school. So there was actually a little bit more blame of people on top. And to me, that's also...
Is that something that you think is a generalizable trend? Obviously, your research based on complete different samples, but do you think there has been a change between the period in which you were doing the research for your first book versus the second book?
I don't know, but to me, the recession is kind of what separates the two, because I did the fieldwork for my first book at the very beginning of the recession in 2008, and then this is sort of a decade later. And I actually think that's possible. And for example, the people I talked to in this book, would listen to Bernie Sanders, and they would think maybe socialism isn't actually that bad, or in a way that I just couldn't imagine happening in the last book. So it's possible.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I wanted to kind of come on to something that I'm personally very interested in is a question of the relationship between anti-politics, trust, and mistrust and authority. So starting, I guess, with mistrust, because I guess that's something that runs throughout. Do you find that there is a greater mistrust of a particular type of organization, be it political institutions or of corporations, or is it just seen as, to use a kind of old style cliche, like the man, is it all kind of one and all kind of authority is to be questioned? And as a follow-on from that, is there, trust is a fungible sort of thing. So do you find that trust gets placed on maybe other institutions as a sort of receptacle for trust, because there can't be trust in corporations or in politics or other institutions, that the people end up trusting maybe the military or trusting the church or trusting, who knows what it might be. Did you find that?
I would say that their distrust, I don't think it's just we shouldn't trust authority. I think there are examples for why they are distrustful are usually very specific and often took place in their own lives. And they would tell stories of believing in an institution and then being betrayed and sort of learning how the world really works. And so, it might be having a, bad experience in the military. It might be having bad experiences in a church or a hospital where they felt like they kind of believed in the system, maybe a for-profit college, and then it turned out not to work the way it was supposed to work. And I think it's actually that they wanted to be able to believe in the institution, like, joining the military out of patriotism, and then just becoming very jaded when they saw what was happening on the ground. And then it seemed like they would then apply the distrust in one sphere to other social institutions.
So it's like betrayal or abandonment rather than just default cynicism.
Yes. Yeah. So it makes sense. I think their experiences do make sense. Yeah, and they're very specific critiques.
So I I guess one of the really striking things that, and probably one of the wider implications of the analysis, is around. So one of your interviewees says the American dream has been stolen. Do you think there is really a shared notion of the nation in the American working class today? Do you think there is something sufficiently coherent that can be said to be this is the idea of America, as or people have come to look for America, as Bernie Sanders' 2016 memorable election video suggested, or is it too fractured? Has that idea of some social contract, which is an idea which comes up a few times in the book, has that been left behind?
I think one unifying theme for most of the people is that either, the American dream is dead or it's dying, and that, if maybe there used to be something called an America, but right now it's really broken. And I really would hear that from everyone, varying race and gender, that, it's almost a fantasy to think people are able to work their way up without help, or, this idea that, and there's this quote in chapter 1 where someone says, like, nothing means nothing anymore. So it's the sense that, everything is about money now, and there's, we don't owe each other anything, and we don't care about anything deeper than profit. And, America, someone says, if you have money, you do what you want, you kill someone, you beat the charge. But, other people, it's like, politicians are going to keep making things good for rich people. They were going to make it harder for me. It doesn't matter. And that's actually, I think, the most is what they share. It's that America is broken, and maybe we can put it back together. But it's definitely a fantasy to think that there is this larger America that we're all part of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, it does come through quite strikingly that, yeah, it would be quite sad, I guess, if the American dream is were to be dead, because it's not an unproblematic idea, but certainly some good parts. I guess maybe one of the key questions of the whole, like, to take a step back, of the whole book for socialists, is whether there's really anything to be encouraged by here, or whether this is a kind of depressing episode of the podcast, because it emerges quite clearly from some of the things that people say, that individual survival and politics don't really seem to be very closely related. It doesn't seem to be there's an easy turn to political solutions for all sorts of problems and causes of pain. I mean, I guess this is probably a question for all of us. I mean, but obviously, Jennifer, you first. Do you think there's anything to take that's positive in terms of the possibilities for organising and for politicising and mobilising and all this kind of quite, this hard work of building political consciousness and coalitions?
I think there is some hope. I mean, it wasn't just this working class saying that, like, we believe in America, and of course if you work hard you can make it, and instead it was people who were extremely critical, who were pointing out all of the ways that institutions have been corrupted by money, and by showing all the ways that politicians have been bought off by corporations, and showing all kinds of ways that profit has become more important than people's lives. And I think, because they're able to do that, they're also, some of them, very critical of racism and of sexism. And I think within that, it kind of forces them to also try to imagine, what would be more fair, or what would justice look like, or what would opportunity actually look like, instead of this idea that there's an American dream. And I mean, I think there's a lot of contradictions and a lot of tensions, but also within that, I think some hope. But the main thing for me is that if people are going to work together, there has to be trust. And I think the trust would have to be rebuilt at a very, like, one-on-one level, right? I don't think you can rebuild trust through, like, a TV ad or something. I think they're too smart for that. They're not going to fall for that. It has to be a relationship that's built over time. So it seems like it would be a lot of work.
I actually had a question which led on directly from that, because I wanted to kind of maybe flip the question around, because obviously the object of your research is kind of the working class, and I wanted to look at it maybe from the other angle, which is, a lot of what you describe is exactly this, not the relationship to institutional politics, but very much a distance from it, and a quite deep mistrust, such that, as you exactly said, it has to be rebuilt, from the ground up. It can't just be trying to reconnect institutional politics or the presidency to the individual experiences of working class people in the towns that you do your research in. But it strikes me that, kind of, if you talk to kind of middle class professionals, you could argue that maybe they believe too much in politics, in the sense that their identification with politics is often very much tied to a certain identity as a liberal or a conservative. And that maybe they kind of over-identify with politics in a way which, in some ways, is a mirror image of the working class people that you spoke to, and maybe the expectation from the part of organizers or people kind of deeply involved in institutional politics is, why don't you should trust us? We're promising this. Why don't you believe us? And I think that's where the big disconnect is. That on one side, you have people who believe perhaps too much in the possibilities of establishment institutional politics, and on the other side, people who believe maybe too little in it.
I think that's true. I mean, I was laughed at for voting by many of my respondents.
I love that. Yeah.
And they're like, why do you think you're so important that you're actually changing things? Like, are you kidding? Like, look at how rigged the system is. And in a way, like, there's something for me to learn from them too. Like, thinking how important my vote is when, and maybe instead of actually me, like, thinking about all the ways that, I don't have power and maybe I should be more critical of. So yeah, I think that's important. I think that I like your point about the identity as an activist among the middle class.
So I guess I had a question which, to kind of take the analysis in a different context almost, that in the UK we have it's almost a moral panic amongst some of the political class around what are called Labour heartlands. So these ideas that here are some places in the country that need to be voting Labour or ought to be voting Labour, and are these kind of bastions of the organised working class in the past. I guess this makes me think, what has been the response to the analysis? I mean, I guess particularly perhaps amongst some of the people that Alex maybe mentioned, some of the activists amongst the professional managerial class or the middle class. I mean, do you think that this has had any impact on the way that, for example, the Democratic Party would understand what the task facing it in the 2020 election is, for example? Because I think the misunderstanding of what was ahead of it in the 2016 election was quite striking, and obviously led to the consequences that we all know about.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm not really sure, but I think this idea that you can win elections by mobilizing non-voters, like I think it might kind of challenge that idea, or at least show like how mobilizing is not maybe as easy, because people have like really deeply rooted belief systems that come out of their own experiences. For why they shouldn't be mobilized, or why they don't believe in the system, and why they think that voting would just legitimate a system that was rigged against them. So I think that's something that maybe could be part of it. And then also I think for the Democrats, like kind of in a way, like, don't be so smug and think that you're obviously the party of the working class, because they don't trust you and they don't think that you're serving them, and they think you're kind of just as bad as the other side. And so that might kind of force some rethinking about maybe putting class and inequality as much more central to the Democratic Party message than it had been.
I think if that were a lesson that were learnt by the left across Europe and in America, that would be extremely useful. But yeah, I think, thanks so much for joining us. I think that's, it's an extremely wide-ranging discussion, but not as wide-ranging, I think, as the book, which is, I sound like I'm on commission for it, but, just to say, really, really excellent. So yeah, thank you. Very much, Jennifer, for joining us.
Fun.
And
thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it was great to chat to you.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed meeting you.
Oh, is that a thumbs up emoji? Cool.
I've never done this before, but I'm enjoying it.
Okay, let's see if I can reciprocate. Sorry, Alex normally handles the very smooth and professional closing of interviews and stuff like that. So that's why I kind of mangled it a little bit.
The thumbs up emoji actually just, I mean, our listeners won't be able to see that, but I certainly appreciated it. So I think that's a good as closing as we can have. That's brilliant.
We need an audio ident of a thumbs up emoji.
Yes.
All right, that's it for this week. Thank you very much again to Jennifer Silva. Thank you, listener, for tuning in. If you like what we're doing, as always, please drop us a review wherever you can. We'll be back in the new year with many more discussions on the themes of trust, authority, and anti-politics. Just a shout out for what's coming up until the end of the year. We have a pre-election episode coming out this coming Tuesday. That's right, we're switching to Tuesday publication dates, so keep an eye out for that. This will be our last Thursday episode. This came out on Thursday, the 28th of November. The next one out will be Tuesday, the 3rd of December, where we'll be doing a preview of what is likely to be a generational election in the UK. Whichever way the results go, its impacts are likely to be long felt. So tune in for that on Tuesday. We'll have a post-election special as well, which will be a free episode. And coming up on Tuesday, the 10th of December, will be our 100th episode. We'll be doing a special episode, drawing in a whole range of voices to reflect on 1989, 30 years on. So please do tune in for that. Thank you for listening as always. Catch you later. Bye-bye.